Dr. Stevens, welcome to Constituting America's Constitutional Chats. We're so happy to have you with us today. And we're going to let you give a few opening comments on the topic of justice inherent in our inalienable rights.
Well, thank you very much, Kathy, for that introduction, and thanks to Constituting America for having me on here this afternoon. Very happy to be here. Yes, so the topic, justice inherent in our inalienable rights. I think this is a very important topic, because it shapes our understanding of ourselves. It shapes our understanding of government. And it also shapes our understanding of the role and the powers of government as well. All right. So again, you really couldn't have picked a more important topic than this one. We find the clearest expression, I think, of the idea of inalienable rights, especially justice inherent in our inalienable rights. We find the clearest expression of that in the Declaration of Independence, right? Especially there in the second paragraph. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Right. So the idea we get from the Declaration of Independence is that all men, all of mankind, all human beings are born. They are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. You could say unalienable, inalienable. The Declaration says unalienable. I love going to some of the early state constitutions and the Federalist Papers. They will use words to describe these same rights, right? They'll call them natural rights, inherent rights, indubitable rights, indefeasible rights, essential rights. All of those terms basically mean the same thing. What we're talking about are the rights that you are endowed with, that you are born with by nature, by God, or even going back to that first paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, right? God and nature, the laws of God and nature, which means that these rights cannot be taken away from you. They can be violated. They can be taken away from you unjustly, right? They can be violated, but they can't be separated from you. In a way, right, I can cut off my hand and I'm still a human being. But if you deprive me of all of my natural rights, I'm no longer a human being. You have turned me into a slave. And this helps us to understand where justice fits into this picture. Because without natural rights, without inalienable rights, whatever you want to call them, without natural rights, all rights would simply be positive, right? Meaning that they would simply be given to you by government or the society in which you happen to find yourself in. Which also means, right, if government gives you your rights, or if society gives you your rights, that also means they can be taken away by government or by society, right? These are what we sometimes call conventional rights, or again, positive rights, or privileges, right? The privileges of citizenship. Right. So I know we have some young people in the audience here. And I know we also have some parents of young people in the audience. Right. My parents always told me growing up that driving is a privilege, not a right. Right. So, right, if I did something, right, I shouldn't have been doing, right, I would be punished with, right, I'd lose the car privileges, right, because driving is a privilege, not a right. Without natural rights, then all rights are merely privileges to be given and taken away as, right, either, right, the state or government, or even right, the mob, right, even the people themselves, right, may decide, right? So the point is that natural rights don't change. Natural rights don't change. They're permanent, and therefore they become a permanent standard for judging whether or not something is just or unjust, whether or not government is good or bad, just or unjust. Because again, go back to the Declaration of Independence, where we're told that the purpose of government is to secure the people's natural rights. That's the purpose of government, the security for those inalienable rights. If that's the purpose of government, the protection for natural rights, then you have a standard by which to judge government. Now you can have other, right, you can make other standards, I suppose, right? But if you want to root one in justice, you have to go back to natural rights. Because if you don't have natural rights, then all rights are merely arbitrary. Government doesn't give you your rights. For example, the Constitution. I hear some people once in a while talk about how the Constitution gives us our rights. The Constitution gives us the right to freedom of speech. That's not true. The Constitution protects your right to freedom of speech, right? The Constitution is meant to protect your natural rights. Now, you do have other rights. You do have these other, like I said, conventional or positive rights, the civil rights, the rights of citizens, right? So, for example, voting. Voting, as strange as it may sound, voting is not a natural right. It's not a right that exists in a state of nature or that human beings, all human beings possess. Voting is a citizen right? Voting is a civil right. Because surely we don't allow children to vote in our elections. There are some other guidelines. We don't allow 99% of the country really to vote in our elections. If that were a natural right, if voting was a natural right, there'd be something wrong with that. But even though voting's that conventional right, it's still a very, very important conventional right. One that Americans especially are attached to, and rightfully so, because we see it as a guard, a sentinel to the protection and preservation of our more essential natural rights: life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, among others, the Declaration tells us. And by the way, that's a curious little phrase there in the Declaration, right? Among others, which assumes that you have other rights besides those big three listed in the Declaration: life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. So other natural rights that, say, the founders would talk about. You have a natural right of property. You have the natural right to pursue and acquire and use and dispose of your property. You have a right to the freedom of conscience, to your religious opinions. Religious liberty, right, is a very essential natural right, which again, the First Amendment doesn't give you that right. Even if you repealed the First Amendment, you would still have your right of freedom of speech and press and religion and petition and assembly, because those are human rights. Those are inalienable rights. They can't be taken away from you. And that means, of course, they can't be given to you, even by a constitution. And I'll just wrap up my opening remarks by again talking about what this has to do with understanding justice, why natural rights are so important to justice. Think of Abraham Lincoln, for example. Think of Abraham Lincoln in the Civil War and the arguments he had to make and persuade the country on in regards to the injustice of slavery. How do you make an argument against slavery, right, as unjust and immoral without natural rights? You can't do it. Yeah, you can argue that, okay, it's not as effective as free labor, right? But effectiveness is a different standard than a standard rooted in justice. You can't make an argument against slavery as unjust and immoral without natural rights. Go back and read some Lincoln speeches, especially in like the 1850s. I love his Peoria address, for example, from 1854, where he talks about this at length. Lincoln is a great teacher, and he is a great teacher, along with Thomas Jefferson, about justice inherent in inalienable rights.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Stevens. I loved your comments, and it just took me back to my days of driving. When I was growing up, driving was definitely a privilege and not a right. So, and I love your comments of natural rights don't change. So I know we have a lot of questions. I'm going to hand it over to Janine.
Oh, thanks, Kathy. Can y'all see me? Yeah. Okay. Yes. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Stevens. And so I also echo what Kathy accentuated when you said that even if we didn't have the First Amendment, we still have these rights because we're born with them. And I think that is the innate. So where do you think just to get philosophical for a minute, the innate justice then it is innate, and it is given to us by our Creator. You want to talk about that for just a little bit? That it's not man get you did already, but I mean, I just think, how do you explain this to people? Because there seems to be a narrative out there where we can vote away these rights if we want to. How do you explain this to the modern day world in a soundbite?
Yeah, that's a very excellent question. In fact, that's not just a modern problem, but that is the problem that we've had to face as a people throughout our history. Right, the issue of being able to destroy or vote away natural rights was at the heart and soul of the American Revolution. It was at the center of the crisis of the 1850s and Stephen Douglas's popular sovereignty on the brink of civil war. It was at the center of the progressive era, in the late 19th, early 20th century, where there was this turn away from the idea, in all cases, away from the idea of natural or inherent or inalienable rights that all human beings have, and a turn towards, I don't want to get too philosophical here, but a turn towards thinking that rights are not natural, but that are the inventions of civil society, and that you have rights not as human beings, but as members of whatever particular society, that you are associated with. That's not how the American founders thought about our inherent natural rights. And you raise a good point. Like, how can you persuade somebody of the truth of this? How can you persuade somebody of a self-evident truth, as the Declaration says, that all men are created equal and have natural inherent rights? The short answer is you really can't. You can't, because it's the starting point. That self-evident truth, the word itself, it contains within itself the evidence of its own existence, of its own truth. That's your starting point. This is what, in Euclidean geometry, they call like an axiom, or a maxim. It's your starting point. And from there, all the other truths, spring. But if you don't accept that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator, the God of nature, as the first paragraph puts it, with certain unalienable rights, it's hard to have you're right. It's hard to have a conversation. It's hard to have a dialogue. Self-evident truths can be denied. And this is why groups like Constituting America are so important. They still need to be taught. And so in the same way you might teach geometry, the Pythagorean theorem, gravity, other self-evident truths, you can teach natural rights. It's hard. It's a difficult process. That's why I'm not jealous of the hard and good work that all of our teachers out there do in helping to make human beings and helping to make citizens.
Yeah, so I guess you could say, First Amendment rights are not a vote, or something. But to understand the concept, because I love history and I read everything is historical that I read. And the number one fight, whether it was in the 16th century or the 13th century or the 7th century, whatever it may be, is we want to be able to speak our mind. We want to be able to worship as we please. And what dictators do, it's also, I think there's a modern day aspect to what's happening internationally, because if you go to some of these other countries like Russia or China or North Korea or things of that nature, they don't give them those rights. They, in North Korea, it's like, I'm God. It really is important that this is taught in schools, and it's not taught in schools, and that's dangerous. I mean, how do you? It's just like everyone doesn't want to say God in schools and all that, and freedom of religion I get, and I agree, freedom of religion. But how do we in the schools still teach these fundamental principles that if you're living in a jungle, right? If you're born and you're living in a jungle and there's no other, there's only like 10 of you on the whole world, you didn't have a Declaration of Independence innately, right? You want to be able to speak your mind. I guess so it's interesting to be able to educate. I'm asking you an educational question. We have 5 minutes left in my segment, but an educational question. But yeah, also the foreign aspects, that it just doesn't exist in so many other countries. And so I filmed the movie in China. Everybody knows this. They've heard me say it like a zillion times. But I could see how they just didn't have the understanding of it, and they grow up not even knowing. And we've had a wonderful show here about North Korea. They don't even know they really do think Kim Jong-un's a god, and they're not, because they're not taught. So I guess my question is an educational question, and how I guess the number one thing, if you want to have someone that understand that this right can't be voted, these fundamental First Amendment rights are not up for vote, is try to take it away from them. You know what I mean? Oh no, you can't.
That's a great point. Yeah, that's a great. And by the way, you mentioned, right, the right to think for yourself and the freedom of conscience, right? That's another essential, inherent, natural right that the founders held very dear to. We mentioned Thomas Jefferson in his Virginia Statute for Religious Liberty. That document opens up with the line, "Whereas Almighty God hath created the mind free." Why do we believe that speech must be free? Because we believe that the mind is free. If the mind is free, speech must also be free. And you're absolutely right, Janine. Right, when it comes to educating, especially the next generation of American citizens, right, in the tradition of natural rights, that's a hard job. The thing about self-evident truths is that they're obvious to you, but they're only obvious to you after you've been enlightened to them. Like the Pythagorean theorem, right, in geometry. It's obvious to us once we learn it, right? But it has to be taught. It has to be learned. We have to be enlightened to it before we come to accept it, which is why, and again, as you mentioned, so many other regimes, right, end up rejecting, right, these truths, especially the truth, right, that all men are created equal and they have certain inherent, unalienable natural rights that, right, they cannot part with. They can be violated, they can be forfeited, but they cannot be, right, they cannot be completely taken away.
Yeah, so in curriculums, it would really be good to have sort of, what would we call this? Classical theory. What would you call it?
Yeah, I've always preferred the term liberal arts, right? The teachings and responsibilities of what it means to be a human being. We used to call something like this civics, right? Related to, right, the making of not just of human beings, but also of citizens. And in part of that making involves, I think, a teaching of the Declaration of Independence and who we are and where our rights come from. And you mentioned God and religion earlier. I love reading some of the early political sermons of the American founding, especially in New England, where they make this sort of argument. They make this case that it goes back to God, but it's God and nature. It's not sort of a very heavy, right, specific religion that is influential here. This is an idea of God as the God of nature who has created human beings and endowed us with certain natural rights. That I don't think that I think is not controversial.
Yeah. Well, it's just interesting that I just really feel it needs to be taught.
Janine, I think you're muted.
Am I muted?
No, I can hear you.
I'm not muted.
From any state, the executive authority thereof shall issue writ.
Oh, wow. We're hearing somebody's. Okay. Interesting. We're having a few technical difficulties. Okay. Yeah. Well, I think, I know that they're trying to do moments of silence up here, in New York City. And I've been to charter schools where they have these they start their days with talking about this type of thing. And I really would recommend, I just think it's important that everybody understands how these are innate and they can't be taken away. They're not a vote. They're not a vote away. Well, it's really good to know that. Okay, I'm going to pass at the exact right time here, a little early, 3:25 to Tova, so we can stay on schedule and everybody has a chance to talk. So thank you so much, Dr. Stevens.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that really fantastic introduction. What I wanted to ask, first of all, is about the criminal justice system, because we've talked a lot on this show about like the concept of justice, but I was just thinking we haven't really connected that to the criminal justice and legal system as it exists today. So obviously the legal system is our primary method of holding our fellow citizens accountable for when we believe they violated justice in our society. And so I was curious, how did the founding fathers envision the criminal justice system, and sort of how has it developed throughout history?
That's a great question, Tova. Thank you very much for asking that. And that has everything to do with our topic here this afternoon. As far as what the founders have to say about the criminal justice system, right, I would recommend maybe looking at a piece that Thomas Jefferson writes on a bill proportioning crimes with punishments, where essentially the principle is the punishment ought to fit the crime. It ought not to be excessive, and it ought to be deficient. It ought to deter others from committing a like offense, and it ought to deter the offender from trying to do the same offense again. And a lot of this is rooted in other political theorists, especially a guy named John Locke, who I'm sure most of you are familiar with, where Locke says something very similar about punishment. It needs to cover both grounds of what Locke calls reparation and restraint, meaning reparation, what was taken is returned, and restraint, making it an ill bargain for the offender. And so what this means in practice is, and this is related so much to what Janine was talking about earlier about teaching these principles, right? Looking to religion, looking to revelation, you can come to know these things through revelation. The founders tell us as much, but the founders say you can also come to discover these self-evident truths for yourself through reason, right? Through using human reason. Revelation is not the only way you can come to the truth of the self-evident truths contained in the Declaration. Human reason, human beings are reasonable creatures, and therefore they are capable of thinking about justice. They are capable of distinguishing between the just and the unjust, right and wrong, good and bad, advantageous, disadvantageous. And the criminal justice system ought to be founded on that precept, right? That through the rule of law, human beings are capable, of punishing accordingly, so the punishment does meet the crime. And sometimes that means taking away a portion of the criminal's natural rights, right? You find somebody, for breaking the law, violates their right to property. You put somebody in prison, right? That's a violation of liberty. You even capital punishment, take away somebody's life in extreme circumstances. These can be violations of your natural rights, but I shouldn't say violations, because they're really not. There are instances where you are deprived of your natural rights justly. You forfeit those natural rights, but for a very specific reason, right? A crime against the society has been committed, right? A law has been broken. And so the person does a crime, and they pay a penalty. And the people themselves of that community determine what that penalty is through what we refer to as the rule of law, which applies equally to everybody. So sorry, that's sort of a law. I want to stop talking. I want to give you a chance to chime in here.
No, that's really interesting. And kind of to play devil's advocate or put out a challenging question is, how do we then determine when we are allowed to deprive someone of their natural rights in the name of justice, for instance, or to deprive someone of natural rights justly, as you phrased it? What's to stop a corrupt society from arguing that they can deprive someone of their natural rights because of something that the society considers to be unjust, but maybe others don't? For instance, and this wouldn't happen in the US, but for instance, practicing a religion. What if a society says, well, that's a violation of our society's values, so we should be able to imprison people for practicing their religion and deprive them of natural rights? How do we navigate that?
Yeah, great question. Another great question. Look, the way we navigate that, it goes back to what was brought up earlier about education. Right? If you don't have education, if you're not educating the next generation in the principles of a free society, your free society is not going to last. You're not going to be able to maintain that free society. And I'm not arguing here that justice is relative, that justice is whatever the particular regime or society thinks that it is, that whatever the law says is just. I'm certainly not arguing that. But your primary question was, well, how do you tell what justice is, or how that people thinks about justice? You look to their laws. What kind of laws do they have? And this is why, again, the topic that we're discussing today is so important, about justice, inherent in natural rights. How do you judge between good laws and bad laws? How do you judge between good regimes and bad regimes? How do you judge between a Soviet Union versus a United States, or a North Korea and a United States? It goes back to natural rights, because natural rights, they provide that standard for judging whether or not government and society are just or not. If the society is protecting the people's natural rights on the basis of consent, which is the formula we get from the Declaration of Independence, that's what a good government looks like. That's what governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed for the purpose of securing the people's natural rights. Doing that, that provides a standard for justice, for judging our laws and different societies. I'm reminded of Martin Luther King Jr., what he says in the letter from a Birmingham jail, which I would recommend everybody out there to read, where he makes this argument, right? That, right, he talks about the higher law, the eternal law, or the divine law. If the human law doesn't measure up to the eternal law, right, then it's no law at all. And actually, King says disobeying an unjust human law may actually be, right, obedience to that higher law. King then also adds, as long as you're also where you do so peacefully and you're willing to accept the punishment. But how do we judge whether or not laws are good or bad? King says natural rights, right? Look to that higher law, that higher standard. It'll provide a guide.
Right. And that I love the way you elucidated that. But I'm curious if you're saying that the way to judge whether a law is just or unjust is whether it sort of protects natural rights, but then also saying that in our society, the punishment for certain violations of justice is a deprivation of natural rights. For instance, we literally have capital punishment where the government can take people's lives. So I guess my question is, how can natural rights be both a benchmark for whether a law is just, but as a feature of the law, you have the possibility of a deprivation of natural rights?
Such a good question. Yeah, such a good question. Yeah, I mean, in some ways, that's a different webinar talking about the justice of capital punishment. I mean, certainly the founders believe that, right, you can, right, have a society based on natural rights and that can coexist with capital punishment, right? So, for example, even the Constitution itself acknowledges this, right, where it says, right, life, liberty, and property may not be taken without due process of law, right? So in the constitutional language itself admits that life may be taken, but again, in certain circumstances, right, where a crime has been committed, where the law provides the possibility of the punishment for that crime being deprivation of life, and where a legal process, which the Constitution refers to as due process, is followed through. But yeah, your question is a good one, because it sounds like, wait, I thought these rights, you said they can't be taken away from us, but then as punishments for crimes, they often are taken away from us, sometimes even up to and including life. How does that go together? I would, again, highly recommend reading some of these documents from the founders, but also John Locke, where he talks about, in the case of, right, depriving a murderer of his life. Locke says, in that case, when you're dealing with a murderer, you're actually not dealing with a human being anymore. You're dealing with a being that's more like a tiger or a lion that has completely abandoned their reason. They've stopped being reasonable, which is the defining characteristic of human beings, and they've turned into these beasts, these brutes who will just lash out and kill anything, right? If you're dealing with a lion or a tiger, yeah, you have the right not just to defend yourself, but also protect society by getting rid of them.
Well, thank you so much. This was a really, really fascinating discussion. I could talk about it all day, but I see the signs and I will, pass on to the next person, but thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tova. Excellent questions. That was fantastic.
Hello, thanks, Doctor, for the topic accessible to our audience. So my first question is, could you tell us about the middle one in the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness? Liberty is so broad. I'm wondering, why did the founders choose to include liberty?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think you sort of maybe even answered it yourself, but that it is broad, right? And for that reason, it covers a lot of bases, right? So for instance, we talked about earlier in the webinar, we talked about religious liberty, right? Or freedom of opinion, right? Or the liberty of the press, right? Or freedom of speech. Freedom is just another word for liberty, right? Liberty provides this sort of broad umbrella, right? That covers a lot of bases. But at bottom, what liberty means is you have the right to rule yourself. You have the right of what the founders also called the right of self-government, right? I'm reminded of this great line from Madison from Federalist 39, where he says, "We base all of our political experiments on the capacity of mankind for self-government, that human beings are reasonable creatures. They're capable of understanding justice. They're capable of understanding right versus wrong, good versus bad, just versus unjust. And therefore, they're also capable of governing themselves reasonably." If that's not true, if human nature, right, is not if human beings are not capable of governing themselves, if we don't have that understanding of human nature, then Republican government is a pipe dream, because self-government is a pipe dream. Then if that's true, then only the most brutal form of despotism would be capable of controlling human beings. If human nature, I'll put it to you this way, here's how Fed 55 puts it at the very end. If human beings are all bad, then only the most brutal form of tyranny would be capable of controlling them. There are some good elements in human nature. It's a mixture of good and bad. There are some good elements worthy of our esteem and confidence. And Publius in the Federalist Paper says, Republican government assumes assumes the existence of those principles worthy of our esteem and confidence more so than any other form, right? So if human beings aren't capable of governing themselves reasonably, then Republican government is a pipe dream.
And in that answer, it's a full. I mean, there's a lot there. So the way our political system is set up, I mean, recognizing these rights and then trying to create a government which protects those rights while not violating those rights, and trying to keep people from violating the rights of others. So trying to create the most possible freedom and giving away some of our autonomy to our government in order to protect that freedom, but never allowing it to violate those rights. In it, we have, if we just think about like property. So we have the ability of property. So when we're taxed, we're giving some of that property back, and the government, we're giving them that small right to basically take some of our stuff, to appropriate it to the good of the society, in a way. But that understanding that I just said, which is what you said, that's not where we necessarily start from in political discussions, kind of ever. And going back to almost to what a lot of what Janine was talking about, I wonder at our base that our country was made in these documents to work with that as the underlying assumption, of the underlying principles. But if we leave those principles, then it's very hard to understand what we are. And it's very hard to understand a debate not framed and getting that on the table. So I guess the question I'd like you to answer is, how often do you think that when we're having a debate and when we're discussing things politically, that we are keeping that principle in the forefront of the debate, that we are recognizing that first and on the same page and not talking past each other?
Yeah. Again, another very good question. I agree with the sentiments there. It's very well stated. I think you have hit upon a really important issue here, and it's the same issue that confronted the framers of the Constitution at the Constitutional Convention, right, during that sweltering hot summer of 1787, right? We have these principles in the Declaration of Independence, right? We know that the purpose of government is to secure our natural rights on the basis of consent, but then how do you actually go about constructing a government to do that, right? We tried that once under the Articles of Confederation, and it was a miserable failure, right? How do you actually construct a government on the principles of the Declaration, allowing the government to secure the people's rights, but not allowing the government to be too strong that it itself becomes a threat to those same rights, right? So government's purpose is to secure your rights from all sorts of threats, from your neighbors, from foreign nations, right? That's why you need a strong foreign policy. Also from government itself. Government itself may become abusive. And this is part of the lesson of the Constitutional Convention and limited government. Natural rights also assumes that government must also be limited, which is why our Constitution is one of enumerated powers. And one of the central issues at the Constitutional Convention, you mentioned this in your comments, was how do we ensure that government is energetic enough, to borrow a Hamiltonian word? How do we ensure that government has enough energy to do its job to protect your rights, but also that it doesn't have so much power that it then becomes a threat to your rights, right? And trying to thread that needle, that was faced during the Constitutional Convention. Lincoln talks about this a lot, right, in the 1850s and the 1860s, right? That sort of persistent problem of democracy. I think you see the breakdown in the conversation, in the debate, as you refer to it, during the Civil War. But you also see sort of the miracle of the possibilities of that kind of conversation at the Constitutional Convention. Whereas Madison himself, right, refers to the Constitution that emerged from that convention on September 17th, 1787, which we just celebrated this past Sunday, Constitution Day. Madison said, that's a miracle.
And of course, we love studying our founding here, and that's really the reasons why. There's so much there. The more you look, the more you learn. Every time a guest comes on, we learn something that our founders said is indispensable. But how do we never heard this before? One more comment on one of the topics that Janine brought up, because it's something that's on my mind constantly. Is this the concept of rights, while not needing to be tied to one religion, certainly has a philosophical worldview. And while our government was created in brilliance to not give any one person's worldview, give them a higher standing politically in any way or civically in some way, it doesn't make a claim that to an amoral universe or to a it makes a claim that there is the claims of the rights makes a claim to right and wrong. And that seems to be confused often, that as if our Constitution is secular. And I want to know if you would, to me, as I read it, I don't see it that way. I see it as giving people the freedom to worship, yet making it a claim of what the principles that are recognized upon its founding as being what our founding documents believe to be true, but you can believe whatever you want.
Yeah, that's interesting. Very interesting. The Constitution never mentions God. The only reference to religion before the amendments, before the Bill of Rights, specifically the First Amendment, is the no religious test. But the Declaration of Independence mentions God 4 times, right? He's the God of nature. He's the creator who has endowed us with our natural rights. He's also the supreme judge of the world and divine providence. As you mentioned in regards to your question about liberty, right? How the Declaration talks about God is also very broad, right? And creates this very large umbrella where people of various opinions and various faiths, right, could fit under and say, like, yeah, okay, these, as long as you understand that these rights don't come from government or collections of society, don't come from human beings, right, but from something higher, right? Whatever you want to call that something higher, if it's God or if it's right nature, that's another word, right? Human nature, which the Declaration says, yeah, that's from God. Your human nature comes from God, but right, the laws, there are certain laws of nature, gravity, right? That's a law of nature. Maybe there are also laws of our own human nature. This is a question the founders ask. And they say, yeah, one of those laws is that we have these certain inherent, unalienable natural rights, right? That are part of who we are as a human being, that we're born with them, right? We're endowed with them. And that's therefore, right, depending on, how you look at this, the argument is, yeah, God wants us to be free. God is pro-liberty. Or I'll just quote Thomas Jefferson here to conclude. Here's what Jefferson, who was, right, by no means a very religious man, Jefferson himself, though, says, and can the liberties of a nation be thought secure when we have removed their only firm foundation, a belief in the minds of the people that these rights are of the gift of God and are not to be violated, but with his wrath? So long as you don't believe that, right, it's other human beings who give you your rights, you're going to be okay. That's the older version, right? That's the way, like King George and right, the whole world prior to 1776, by the way, thought about rights. They are privileges. They come from the ruling party. They come from the king, right? Magna Carta. You Americans, you really did turn the world upside down, right? When you declared a self-evident truth that all men are created equal.
Wow, what a quote. And pass to some others on the show. Thank you very much, Doctor.
Thank you. Great questions.
Well, thank you, Jewel and Tova and Janine. Great questions so far. And now we'll go to some audience questions. First, we want to take a moment and thank Las Vegas's KKVV that airs these programs Monday evenings at 6 p.m. Pacific, 1060 a.m. on the radio dial. So thank you, KKVV, for airing our constitutional chats. We also want to take a moment to recognize our teachers and students that are watching today. We have Cami Wanaus and homeschool student. We have Lizette Flores with homeschool students, and we have Sherry Stiggle with homeschool students. So thank you to all of our, and if you are a student and or a teacher watching and we didn't give you a shout out, feel free to put your name in your classroom in the Q&A and we'll definitely give you a greeting before the show is over. Now, Dr. Stevens, first of all, we have a couple of really nice comments I want to read from the audience. Hope Mucklow says, wow, that was fantastic. Love the differentiation with between, I guess, conventional and natural rights. What important articulation to encourage all of us to speak better. And then Eve Nichols says, totally loving this presentation, thoughtful Q&A, thank you. And then Douglas Campbell asks, please address the remediation of the erosion of our rights in our lower and higher courts, state and federal.
Yeah, I'd be interested to hear the specific thing the questioner had in mind regarding the erosion of our rights. I'm not sure what erosion is being referred to there. I can use my imagination. It certainly does happen. And that happens because, just going back to an earlier point, you're dealing with human beings, right, who are imperfect, right? We make mistakes. We're unreasonable at times, often a lot of times. As James Madison, or as his friends, Jemmy, they called him not Jimmy, but Jemmy, right? Jemmy Madison said in Federalist 51, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. If men were angels, no government would be necessary. Yeah, when it comes to the application of the rule of law, that's going to be done by men over men. But part of the vision, the dream of the founders was that in America, you would not have a country of men, but of laws, right? Meaning, when you go stand before the judge, you don't get an arbitrary punishment, right? Because you're the member of the wrong political party or the wrong family. You have the wrong last name. But a nation of laws where the law is applied equally to everybody. Does that always happen? No, it's imperfect. We are imperfect creatures and it can be made better. In fact, the story of America is often the story of, right, trying to live up to our principles, of constantly trying to live up to our principles in a better, more perfect way, right? The preamble of the Constitution says part of the purpose of the Constitution was to form a more perfect union. Right. So it's going to happen. Now, if I got more maybe specific information on the details of what kind of erosion we're talking about, then maybe you can address it. But that's sort of that's a broad answer to that broad question.
And speaking of living up to the ideals of the Declaration, you and I were having a conversation a little bit before the show and I have to say, by the way, you've got such a great command of quotes of founding.
Oh, thank you.
You just pull these quotes right out of the air. But you shared with me, and I think the audience would love to hear it, all the different ways that President Lincoln characterized the Declaration of Independence. Because he had some really descriptive ways. When we go into our classroom, we teach the kids that President Lincoln said that the Declaration is the golden apple and the Constitution is a silver frame that protects.
I love that. Yes, that fragment of his. That's one of my favorite Lincoln quotes. Yeah.
Then you had some more, and I'd love to hear them.
Yeah. So first of all, what you were referring to, that's his fragment on Constitution and Union from 1860 or 1861. We're not quite sure. Where you're right, he talks about, and this gets back to the question that was asked earlier, that the Declaration is the apple of gold and the Constitution the frame of silver. So the purpose of the Constitution is to adorn and protect the apple of gold, to make the apple more real, those principles more real. And yeah, it's sometimes hard to live up to that and to put that into practice. But yeah, Kathy, in regards to your question, Lincoln said, I love the speech of his at Independence Hall in Philadelphia, right in between his election and his inauguration as president. Right, he's on the way to DC for his inauguration, and he says there in Independence Hall, where the Declaration and the Constitution were drafted, of course, Lincoln says, "I never had a feeling politically that did not spring from the sentiments embodied in the Declaration of Independence." Again, going back to those self-evident truths, that's the starting point. That's the beginning point for everything else. Lincoln says, my entire understanding of justice is found in that Declaration of Independence. And in regards to that declaration and those principles, specifically the principle of human equality, Lincoln also called it, he called it the sheet anchor of American republicanism. He called it the electric cord that binds all liberty-loving people together. He called it the father of all moral principle in me. And he also called it, that old declaration, he called it my ancient faith. My ancient faith teaches me that all men are created equal. And one of the many things Lincoln teaches us is that, right, it's these principles, these self-evident truths of the Declaration, right, which in Lincoln's own time, many had rejected. Lincoln looked to those principles with hope, right, and used those principles to unite the country again. Right? It's those principles that any thinking, feeling human being, right, can understand. They can reject them, right? Like the Southern secessionists did and the Calhounians before them. They could be rejected, right? But they're also the principles that unite us, because those American principles at bottom, what they are, you're dealing with human principles. Or to put it another way, the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson said, the purpose of the Declaration was to be an expression of the American mind. That's what you see in the Declaration, the American mind, but you also see there the human mind, because all human beings can look to these principles and find hope and inspiration for themselves. Right? Haven't many other foreign, poor, oppressed peoples used the Declaration of Independence and the sentiments embodied in it to justify their own freedom? Absolutely.
Very true. Well, thank you. Those are just beautiful ways to describe the Declaration. Now, Michael asks, I think these days we hear a lot about parental rights and sometimes violation of parental rights. And Michael asks a question about that in relationship to inalienable rights. Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, the founders and Locke have a lot to say about that as well. Essentially, here's what they say about like children. That's another complication, right? The Tova brought up, well, what about criminals? Children are another issue because, right, to deal with a toddler, right, it does not seem to be very good evidence that all men are created equal and reasonable. Right? I mean, you don't ask your toddler for his or her consent before putting her down for a nap. What the founders and Locke would say is that, yes, children are born to equality. They are born with these natural rights, but it's undeveloped. And it's part of the responsibility and duty of parents to rule their children without their consent, but for their good until the law, right, recognizes them as coming to the age of reason, right, which in our society is 18. During the founding, it was generally thought of as 21. Right, so but the rule of the parent is temporary until the child comes of age and is capable of reasoning and governing himself or herself. So yeah, they have those natural rights. Or I'm reminded of this passage from Frederick Douglass, right, the American slave, in his narrative, where he wrote, having conversations with other little white boys and white girls. He's right. Little Douglas would say to them, when you get to turn 21, you'll be free, but I'm a slave for life. That's the difference.
Well, thank you for that. And I want to circle back to our panel one more time. I think, Janine, do you have any other questions that you wanted to ask that you didn't get to ask?
Yeah, what time is it? Yeah, because Tova had one too, so I want to make sure I get to Tova. Hi, Dr. Stevens. I echo Kathy. You've done a fantastic job.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, I could just sit and listen to you forever.
You guys are great.
It's a fun forum, isn't it?
It is. These are fantastic questions.
Yeah, it's fun because all of us ask questions from a different perspective, so it leads to a dynamic conversation. I just have a quick question, and then I'll toss, and Jewel and Jordan might have another question too. How do we deal with this kind of permeating thought, which you touched on a little bit, but we'll just kind of go back to it. We have these rights. They're given to us by a creator. They can't be voted away. Our founders one of the first to say these rights don't come from on paper, the king or whomever, that they're innate. But then a lot of people say, yeah, but we have failed with that, and not everybody's had their rights and whatnot, which is true. Okay, so how do we still not throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? Like, okay, well, we just didn't do any good, so it's all over in my throat. I mean, it's just it's so hard to kind of permeate the thought, so to speak, that you talked about it, right? We're all human and we're all going to make mistakes, but that's a hard thing to teach. It's like, yes, our founders put this forward, and we haven't always done it right. We failed at it a lot of times, but we keep trying. But a lot of people say, well, then we should just, negate the whole thing. How do we deal with that black and white thinking instead of the nuanced thinking of, look, it's here and we're going to try? I think the greatest thing to do is to turn it around upon ourselves. Like one finger out is three pointed back at you. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Say, okay, well, I messed up. I thought I was going to do this, but I didn't do a good job. I did that. And so if we can look at our own sense of humanity, maybe we can understand others' humanity as well. But how do we not throw the baby out with the bathwater in our national thinking?
Yeah, another really, really good question. So it takes me back to the progressive era, which I mentioned earlier in the webinar, that period right after the Civil War, leading from the late 19th, early 20th century, right? Those who called themselves progressives at the time, they were making part of the same argument you just were. They were seeing things in the same way. Well, if we have these natural rights, they don't do us any good. What really does us good are like government protecting us, right? So the progressives, by and large, turn away from natural rights because they look at it as insufficient, right? So they're the ones who, as right, you say, right, throwing the baby out with the bathwater. They throw out natural rights and say, you know what makes you free is being a member of a particular society. But then that's a dangerous way of thinking, because then you're saying like it's government then or society that gives you those rights. And if government gives you those rights, the government can take them away. This is why also in the progressive era, you have, right, progressive imperialism, right? In Cuba, especially in the Philippines, the eugenics program is another consequence of that. But I'm reminded of this great quote from Calvin Coolidge, right, who in the progressive era, he said this about our natural rights. He said, if all men are created equal, that is final. If governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, that is final. If the purpose of government is to secure your natural rights, that is final. No advancement, no progress can be made beyond these principles. To turn away from them is not to go forward, but to go backwards.
That's really good. That's really good. Tova, you want to ask your question in 90 seconds here? That was really good. Turn away from, I like that. Thank you so much.
Yeah, okay, this is a massive question to give you a minute and a half to answer, so I apologize in advance. But I was curious about how do we apply the concept of justice to, for instance, there's this big debate now about reparations for historical injustices, such as slavery or colonization that like haven't really, people argue, been justly dealt with. So I guess in your opinion, what are the limits of justice? Can justice be like an intergenerational thing? And if justice isn't served in one generation, can it be applied in another one, or is there a time?
That is such a good question. And you're right. I can't answer it in 90 seconds. I don't even think you can answer it in a 90-minute webinar. I would recommend, I love these primary documents. I love that Constituting America, all you folks do as well. I would recommend reading Lincoln's second inaugural and what Lincoln has to say about justice and how the Civil War, Lincoln thinks, he hypothesizes that the Civil War was justice delivered by a just God to both North and South for the sin of American slavery. Lincoln doesn't call it Confederate slavery or Southern slavery. It's American slavery. We're all at fault here, Lincoln says. And that's why the Civil War was so great and so terrible for both sections, because of that great, horrible national sin. But then the last paragraph is a paragraph of hopefulness for the future. Malice towards none, charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right. Let us struggle along to bind up the nation's wounds. As a people, we have always had a conversation, a debate about justice. That conversation and debate is going to continue. Thank God.
Well, and we are right at the top of the hour. So thank you so much, Dr. Stevens. Just a beautiful job today. And we really are honored to have you on. And the audience got so much out of it. We had a couple of other very nice audience comments. So thank you so much for being on. And we want to invite everybody to come back next week. We are doing justice in the U.S. Supreme Court, and we're going to be walking our audience through how the Supreme Court works. So it's going to be really educational and enlightening session.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Stevens. Terrific, really terrific. And Tova and Lacey and Julian Jorn, Kathy, great show. Thank you so much, Dr. Stevens. Impressive.
Thank you.
Thank you.